It's been present in our market and being discussed amongst many key people within the community for the past 20 years. Zero Trust is built on a framework, a number of principles within the cybersecurity framework. For example, we discuss about the importance of least privilege access policies, user access policies, compliance and governance. Such things within this framework are really dependable and built from down up to achieve zero trust. Throughout this presentation, we'll be going past the buzz and the hype behind the term zero trust. We'll be understanding the key concepts of what zero trust is, what is driving zero trust in our day, in current day, and what are some of the outcomes and challenges we might face. We will be also reviewing how a traditional network model is represented in some organizations and how we can proceed in this journey to achieve zero trust maturity. Afterwards, we'll be reflecting on a modern take of what a network model should be represented in an organization. Okay. Just a quick recap on the agenda. These are the topics of discussion we'll be looking over to today. So firstly, let's take a moment to define what zero trust is. Zero trust is a security framework requiring all identities, whether in an organization or accessing the organization externally, to be authenticated, validated, and authorized at all times to access the different key pillars of zero trust, which is focused on the devices, focused on the network, focused on the infrastructure and applications, as well as the data. Moving on, we need to understand what zero trust architecture is. So as I mentioned, zero trust architecture is built on a framework, built on a number of concepts which we as security operators rely on heavily to build and understand. As I mentioned, we heavily rely on user access policies, user device access policies as well. We try to understand and determine that all users that are accessing this environment have the required validation, authentication, and authorization to have permission to review and access all of the critical infrastructure within an organization. So, understanding the key concepts and understanding what it is to have a zero trust mindset, we always need to take the fundamental concept of never trusting and always verifying. From a security standpoint, understanding how digital transformation is working like nowadays. We have a large number of data points or access points for users to interact with an organization, whether it's business to business, client to business. We have our vendors, we have our architects which are working remotely. We have our clients which are accessing from outside the region. We have to always assume that the people we are interacting with on a daily basis are not who they are always. We need to consistently validate this trust with whoever accesses our network. As I mentioned, least privilege access or least privilege concepts are always being discussed within the security realm. We heavily rely on it to minimize the liability, the risk on an organization by ensuring that unauthorized access to sensitive information is restricted as much as is possible. From a security operation standpoint, we need to ensure to always assume breach. As I mentioned, we need to always make sure that we do not trust who is accessing this information. An analyst needs to validate this information using the security services and solutions within the network perimeter to determine whether or not this is a legitimate activity or a malicious activity. So, as I mentioned, there are drivers and there are outcomes and challenges when trying to implement zero trust. One of the key drivers that we need to consistently think about is how we are digitally transforming on a day-to-day basis. We have a large, let's say, we have a really large attack surface for threat actors and adversaries, APTs, to exploit and gain access to the network. This concept really does put a lot of stress and strain on organizations when thinking about how to achieve zero trust and how to achieve maximum security. This is a concept that relies on zero trust heavily. We need to consistently authenticate and validate and authorize users through automation, orchestration. We have to rely on governance to achieve this. As I mentioned, adversaries, APTs, attackers are the main stakeholders within this. They consistently try to target organizations for a number of various purposes, and they are increasingly outmatching the security defenses and measures being placed by organizations. They have been finding different ways to target organizations and compromise organizations. So, what are some of the outcomes that we might gain from achieving the zero trust mindset? So, we can have an architecture which is governed by strict policies, procedures, and standards that are in place by key stakeholders, whether we rely on governing bodies to push these standards, or we rely internally on the risk and governance team to achieve this. As I mentioned, one of the key aspects is consistently monitoring and tracking and authenticating and validating. Security operations heavily rely on zero trust for orchestration and automation to achieve this. We have to rely on various security technologies to be placed within the network to be able to extrapolate a number of data points to achieve and understand and correlate all of this information to understand the activities being done. Let's try to understand some of the challenges we face. Organizations are dynamic and ever-growing, and it's very hard to figure out and understand how to make sure all teams are collaborating consistently. There will be challenges amongst all teams to achieve zero trust. And by aligning all of these teams, it's going to require a lot of time to reach the end goal of achieving zero trust architecture. We have a reliability, and we have to rely on ensuring our systems availability for our clients, for our employees, for our business operations to continue. Establishing zero trust principles can sometimes cause to break these solutions from operating, causing downtime, causing cost on organizations. Setting up zero trust governance doesn't only require to understand the framework and principles at a simpler level. It requires a further, deeper understanding on how the technology operates and works, how clients interact with these systems, and what the potential future of technology development continues to happen. So I just want to take a brief moment just to explain how our traditional network looks like in an organization. So we have a number of devices which are connecting to our network. We have our cloud solutions, we have a perimeter firewall with some minimal single sign-in authentication applications, as well as some users authenticating using multi-factor technologies. We can recognize that the corporate environment is managed on a single layer. All of the devices are connected and being segregated on a simple switch or VLAN. You have your Linux servers, you have your Windows server, you have your file, your financial servers. You have to rely on a number of different technologies to operate your business, to operate your business, you'd say. From a zero trust perspective, by assessing and looking at this, you can understand that the organization here is at its initial stages, and it's far from reaching the optimal stage. So let us take a moment to understand what the zero trust maturity model is. So the zero trust maturity model is built on a number of principles. It's structured across cutting capabilities, focused on governance, automation, orchestration, visibility, and analytics, with key pillars on identity, devices, application and workloads, networks, and data. Visibility refers to the simple concept of being able to have an overview, an oversight of all of the activities that are happening within your network, within your environment, whether it is focused on the identity aspect, the devices aspects, applications, workloads, network, and data. Automation and orchestration is a huge thing being implemented within organizations, understanding that the capabilities are shifting towards a new modern take. We heavily rely on automation and orchestration to achieve specific security activities within all of these domains. Finally, a discussion that's already been there, or a topic that's already existent within an organization, is focused on the governance aspect. A lot of organizations have a dedicated team to focus on governance, and they are slowly needing to change their ideologies and methodology and how they manage the security risk. So, where does an organization start? We just looked at an example diagram of what a traditional network model looks like. Some organizations are starting at the traditional phase, where they rely a lot on manual configuration, where they rely on static security policies, lesser privileged access policies are established, and there is no proficient governance or standards being addressed. Organizations should aim to reach an optimal state. But before reaching an optimal state, they're required to move and progress through different stages by going through an initial stage and advanced stage. In an initial stage, there is a brief introduction of automation solutions within the architecture. There is an integration of external systems outside of the organization network to ensure the business operations are done correctly, as well as having a set of security solutions across the network to ensure they have an aggregated visibility of all the incoming and outgoing traffic. Moving on to an advanced state, you need to have more automated controls. These controls are able to be quicker, more reactive than a human, without the need for human intervention. There is centralized visibility for all of the identification being handled within the organization. There is a structure being held in place where a lot of the governing bodies within the organization can revert back to make executive decisions. Similarly, there is a predefined preset number of mitigations being in place to counteract all of the actions that are going to be occurring within the organization. So, what does it take to reach an optimal zero trust model within your network? Here's an example of what we can consider to understand where our position is within the maturity model. So we have a various number of domains mentioned, or pillars, I would say. These pillars can be defined as follows. Identity refers to the attribute or set of attributes that uniquely describe an agency users within the entity. A device is the reference to the assets, IoT devices, personal mobiles, laptops, so on and so forth. Applications and workloads are what your internal team relies on to operate their business daily tasks. Your network, simply as your routers, your switches, your firewalls, so on and so forth. Finally, and the most important and critical asset, your data. So, how do we understand where we are? How do we benchmark ourselves? So, as I mentioned, we heavily rely on governance, automation and orchestration, visibility and analytics to achieve optimal states of maturity. As you can see, if we start off from the initial side, we are able to progress onto the optimal side by implementing specific things. So, in initial stages, for example, if we were to understand and see what it takes to be an initial, multi-factor authentication is applied amongst the organization, but at a very granular level, we'd say. This would happen potentially at the early stages when accessing the corporate environment. This doesn't consist of what happens within the corporate environment itself when accessing internal applications, so on and so forth. There is less focus on monitoring the access points for users to enter the organization. We just focus on the user access logs being generated from the system itself, and that's about it. Ensuring we achieve an optimal state and trying to achieve that is not an easy task. It's a process that takes a lot of collaboration, a lot of initiative, and a lot of planning. I want to focus specifically on a key aspect that's highly influencing our business operations. We consistently see integration of different vendors coming in and going out of the organization, and we have limited control over how they conduct their activities. However, we are able to enforce strict policies when they are interacting with our own organization. So, what is it, and how can we ask ourselves, and how do we assess ourselves to understand whether we are able to deal with the cybersecurity supply chain and whether we can enforce zero trust? Here are some sample questions you need to be asking yourselves to understand which stage you are when it comes to dealing with the supply chain. When it comes to identities, you can ask yourself, is there a supply chain risk management policy in place? A lot of organizations need to fundamentally understand the foundation to enabling a security model needs to be structured with a standard operating procedure by setting a list of standards, by operating at a strict, I would say, hardened mindset. This would allow to restrict the possibility of exploitation, reducing the risk on the organization. Having an inventory list, being able to track back and looking at all of your data within the organization is key and fundamental to always, whether it's from a security perspective, from analyzing incidents, trying to track and see what happens, or it's important to have this kind of information to be able to set structured timelines, access policies, so on and so forth, to deal with this. If we were to focus on different things, such as the network, for example, we need to ask ourselves sometimes some questions. Do we have any sort of visibility on how users are interacting in our network? Do we have restrictive policies that constrain users from moving around laterally? It's important to consistently be asking the right questions. Sometimes we don't have the knowledge or understanding of where to start, but starting a plan and finding out where you are based on these key component pillars, which is identities, devices, network, applications, and workload, as well as data, allow us to progress further by developing a more structured network. So, we had a brief look at what, let's say, traditional network model looks like. Let's have a look at what a modern zero trust, mature model would look like. As you can see, we have developed the organization by segregating all of the critical assets apart from each other. So, on the right-hand side, we have our business critical segment in our own segregated network. We have our high-impact Internet of Things and operational technologies in a segregated environment. We have our own low-impact devices separately. And finally, we have our legacy systems, which are the most vulnerable critical systems we have within our organization. With that, we have segregated and identified the users that are going to be accessing our environment. We have segregated them to access our organization through our managed internet or unmanaged internets. Amongst that, we have deployed a various number of technical security solutions across our network, while enabling a security operations center to be able to be the focal point or the center which acquires all of this data to be able to take proactive action as much as possible. We have a variety of solutions that are focused on the different pillars. We will have technologies that are focused on ensuring the security of our data. We will have technologies ensuring the security and the resiliency of our network. We will have technologies that are focused on authenticating, validating, and authorizing user access within our organization. We have a variety number of technologies that are focused on automation and orchestration, such as the XDR or the SOAR. These are the kind of technologies we need to be striving to pertain within our organization. We need to be thinking about achieving zero trust to ensure the security risk on an organization is reduced exponentially. There are many concepts being discussed to ensure cybersecurity's strengths. Automation, orchestration, AI, IoTs. There are so many concepts being discussed. An approach and understanding to how to achieve zero trust is key for an organization's growth to deal with the consistent change and dynamic change within the threat actor environment and how APTs consistently are changing and the way they're targeting organizations. That will be all for the discussion today. I thank you all for listening. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.